Dale Pritchard didn't even knock. He just pushed open the gate to Ruth Cal's property like he owned it, because in his mind he already did, and he walked straight up to her porch steps with that slow, deliberate stride of a man who has never once been told no and believed it. Ruth was 47 years old, 3 months behind on her property taxes, and standing in her own yard in mud-caked boots when he held out the paper. "Sign it," he said. "I'll give you 30 days to clear your animals out." Not an offer, not a question, a sentence. 56 half-wheeled turkeys watched from the tree line. The corn was already dying in the field, and every neighbor on that rural road had already heard Dale's version of events, that Ruth Calloway was a stubborn woman running a failing farm into the ground, and that somebody needed to step in before she took the whole township down with her. They all laughed, every single one of them, right up until the cornworms came. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and stay with me, because what happens next will make you question everything you think you know about who gets to decide what a woman is worth. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Ruth Calloway bought 56 turkeys, she did it the same way she made most of her major decisions, quickly, quietly, and in a way that made absolutely no sense to anyone watching from the outside. It was a Tuesday. The livestock auction in Harker County ran every other Tuesday through the growing season, and Ruth had driven 40 minutes in her truck to attend it with exactly $800 in cash and a vague intention to pick up maybe 4 or 5 laying hens. She came home with 56 Narragansett bronze, crosses, 2 borrowed wire crates stacked in the truck bed, and a handshake agreement to collect the rest of the birds the following weekend. She had not planned any of it. The auctioneer had called them heritage birds, semi-feral disposition, not recommended for commercial operations. He said it like a warning. Ruth heard it like a description of herself. She raised her paddle. Her neighbor's son, a 22-year-old named Cody Marsh, who had been standing behind her eating a corn dog, actually laughed out loud. Not a polite laugh, not an embarrassed one. He laughed the way young men laugh when they're certain they're witnessing someone else's mistake, and they want credit later for having seen it coming. Ruth didn't turn around. She just kept her paddle in the air until the hammer fell. The drive home was 40 minutes of recalculating. She had a 14-acre property outside the small agricultural community of Sheldon Creek, Tennessee, not a big operation by any stretch, never had been. The land had belonged to her late husband Curtis for most of their marriage, and when he died 4 years ago, it passed to Ruth, along with a modest mortgage, a deteriorating equipment shed, 11 acres of cornfield that hadn't produced a clean harvest in 2 seasons, and the quiet, persistent judgment of everyone around her who thought a woman alone couldn't run land that size. She'd been proving them half right ever since. Not because she couldn't work. Ruth Calloway could outwork most people she'd ever met. She was up before sunrise. She kept her own books. She'd learned to operate the aging tractor herself through 3 YouTube videos and a lot of swearing. And she hadn't once asked her brother-in-law, Gary, for the money he'd offered and withdrawn, and offered again every 6 months since Curtis passed. The half-right part was the corn. 2 seasons of poor yield, 1 season of a fungal blight that took nearly 30% of the crop before she caught it. The soil was tired. The drainage wasn't right on the low field. And without a partner to help carry the labor load during peak planting and harvest weeks, Ruth was always behind. Not catastrophically. Just enough to make the numbers frightening at the end of every month. She pulled into her gravel drive and sat in the truck for a minute, looking at the property the way you look at something you love that is also costing you everything. The corn was coming up in the east field. It looked fine from the road. It always looked fine from the road. She got out, opened the truck bed, and started unloading the first 2 crates. The turkeys inside were not grateful. They were large, angular birds with copper and gray plumage and the wild-eyed intensity of animals that had spent most of their lives making their own decisions. One of them got a wing through the crate slats immediately and began thrashing. Ruth grabbed it firmly, wrapped it, and held it still against her body until it stopped fighting. "I know," she said to it. "Me too." She got the bird settled in the old barn that night. It took 2 hours, a busted latch she had to wire shut with fence wire, and a minor injury to her left forearm that she cleaned with hydrogen peroxide and ignored. By the time she came inside, it was past 9. She sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and a glass of water and tried to work out what she'd actually just committed to. 56 birds. Heritage breed. Slower growth than commercial turkeys. Better foragers. Better disease resistance. Known for being, in the words of the auctioneer, difficult. Her plan assembled retroactively. Most of her plans was to let them range the cornfield margins. Heritage turkeys ate insects. They ate a lot of insects. Specifically, they ate the larvae of the corn earworm, the fall armyworm, and about a dozen other pests that had been doing to her corn what no fungicide she could afford had managed to stop. She'd read about it once. An article from a land-grant university extension service, buried in a tab account she'd bookmarked 8 months ago and half forgotten. Turkey tractoring, some people called it. Rotational grazing with poultry. Old practice, largely abandoned when chemical pesticides became cheap and farmers stopped needing to think around problems. Ruth couldn't afford the pesticides anymore, not the good ones, so she'd bought past the turkeys. She wrote the number at the bottom of the page, 800 spent, 40 plus more birds to collect on Saturday, feed costs to calculate, fencing to repair, and below that, a single question mark where the income projection was supposed to go. She put the notepad face down and went to bed. She did not sleep well. The first person to say something to her face was her neighbor Pauline Ostrander, who came over on Thursday morning under the pretense of returning a casserole dish and stayed 45 minutes to explain, in careful and well-intentioned terms, why the turkeys were a mistake. Pauline was 63, had farmed her own property for 30 years, and genuinely liked Ruth. That made it harder to hear. Heritage birds are unpredictable, Pauline said. They roost wherever they want. They'll get in your corn. They'll get in my corn. Frank found 3 of Old Harold's turkeys in our equipment shed one year, and they destroyed $2,000 worth of seed bags. I'm going to fence the margins, Ruth said. With what? Ruth didn't answer that immediately, because the honest answer was, with whatever I can put together from what I have left. Pauline looked at her. That particular look, not unkind, just honest, that said she understood the gap between what Ruth was saying and what Ruth could actually do. Dale Pritchard's been buying up parcels on this road, Pauline said quietly, like it wasn't quite a warning but wanted to be. I know. He bought the Kiefer place last fall, paid under market and got it because Margaret Kiefer was 3 years behind on her tax bill. Pauline set the casserole dish on the counter. He's patient, Ruth. That's the thing about him. He just waits. Ruth nodded. She knew about Dale Pritchard. Everybody on Sheldon Creek Road knew about Dale Pritchard. He was 56 years old, ran a mid-size agricultural holding company out of an office in Clarksville, and had a reputation for identifying distressed farmland and moving on it at exactly the right moment. He wore clean boots. He drove a clean truck. He smiled in a way that never reached his eyes. He'd stopped by Ruth's property twice in the past 18 months. Both times he'd been polite. Both times he'd left a card. She still had both cards in the kitchen drawer. She didn't know why she'd kept them. I'm not selling, Ruth said. I know you're not. Pauline picked up her dish. I just think you should know he knows that too, and he's not worried about it. After Pauline left, Ruth stood in the kitchen for a long time. The turkeys were making noise in the barn. They made a lot of noise. It was a sound somewhere between a cackle and a bark, irregular and loud, and she could hear it clearly through the walls. Curtis had always wanted to raise turkeys. He'd mentioned it several times over the years, never quite seriously enough to act on. She thought about that. She thought about a lot of things that had no practical application to her current situation. Then she went out to check the fence line. She got the rest of the birds on Saturday. 51 more. The farmer she'd bought them from, an older man named Chet Bowers, who raised heritage breeds out of pure stubbornness and a vague philosophical objection to commercial agriculture, helped her load them into 2 borrowed livestock tow trailers. He worked quietly and methodically, not saying much, which Ruth appreciated. When they were done, he handed her a folded piece of paper. Management notes, he said. They're not domesticated, not exactly. They think for themselves. You'll spend the first month just learning how they move. Okay. Don't try to control them, he said. Try to direct them. Ruth looked at him. I mean that practically, he said. With fencing. With timing. If you fight them, you'll lose. If you work with how they want to move, they'll do your work for you. She drove home with 51 Narragansett bronze, crosses shuffling and muttering in the trailer behind her. At every stop sign, she could hear them reconsidering their situation. She understood the feeling. The first 2 weeks were, without softening it, brutal. 3 birds escaped through a gap in the south fence she thought she'd patched. She caught 2 of them. The third ranged to the far edge of her property, then turned up 3 days later, roosting in a hickory tree near the creek, apparently unconcerned about the drama it had caused. 4 birds got into a fight over roosting spots in the barn, and one ended up with a gash above its eye that Ruth cleaned and monitored for infection. She sat with it in the barn for an hour, the bird regarding her with one suspicious eye. Both of them too tired to do anything but coexist. She built a rotational pen system from metal T-posts, step-in stakes, and poultry netting. She'd ordered online 3 panels she could shift every few days to move the birds through the field margins systematically. It took her most of a Saturday to design and a full Sunday to install. By Sunday evening, she couldn't fully close her hands from the fence work. She took ibuprofen and kept going. Cody Marsh drove by on the road twice that weekend, slowing down to look. She didn't wave. He didn't stop. Word had gotten around, as word does in small rural communities with speed and precision that would embarrass most intelligence agencies. Ruth Calloway had bought 50-some-odd turkeys. Ruth Calloway was turning them loose in her fields. Ruth Calloway had, it was generally agreed, made a decision that was either brave or foolish, and the community's verdict was leaning heavily toward foolish. She heard it secondhand Pauline, who delivered information the way she delivered casserole dishes, with genuine care and an awareness that it might not be entirely welcome. "People are talking," Pauline said one morning over the fence. "People talk," Ruth said. She was pulling a fence stake that had gone in crooked. "Dale Pritchard told someone at the feed store that he gives you till August." Ruth paused. She looked at the stake. "He said that out loud?" "Apparently." She pulled the stake, reset it, drove it back in. "Good," she said. "He can mark it on his calendar." But that evening, alone in the kitchen with her notepad, the numbers looked the way numbers always looked, when you were scared of them larger, more fixed, more final. She was 3 months behind on the property tax. She had until the end of the fiscal year, which was October, before the county could begin lien proceedings. She had enough feed money for approximately 8 weeks at current burn rate. She had 56 turkeys in her field margins, eating insects, doing their work in the way that semi-feral things do, chaotically, imperfectly, with no regard for the schedule she needed them to keep. She believed in the plan. She did. She just couldn't see all the way to the end of it yet. The first real sign came on a Wednesday. She was walking the east field margin, checking the netting, when she stopped and crouched down next to a cornstalk she'd been watching for a week. The earworm damage she'd been tracking, the frass, the silk browning, the telltale entry holes had not advanced. She checked 3 more stalks, 4 more. She pulled out her phone and took photos, comparing them to photos from the same section. 2 weeks earlier, the damage had stopped spreading. She stood up slowly, looked down the fence line to where 17 of her birds were working the margin with the systematic, ground-level intensity of animals that have exactly one purpose and know it completely. They moved through the grass and field edge with their heads low, pecking at the soil surface, turning over debris. She watched them for a moment. Something shifted in her chest. Not relief, it was too early for relief. But something. She texted Pauline a single photo of the stalk. No message. Just the picture. Pauline texted back, "What am I looking at?" Ruth typed, "What's not there?" She walked back to the house. She'd have to watch for 2 more weeks before she could trust it. She knew that. But she walked a little differently back to the house. She was inside finishing supper when the knock came. Not a casual knock. 3 solid raps. The kind of knock that isn't really asking. She already knew who it was before she opened the door. Dale Pritchard stood on her porch steps in clean boots and a pressed shirt, holding nothing, which somehow made it worse. A man with papers at least telegraphed something. A man with empty hands can claim to be making a friendly visit. "Evening, Ruth." Dale. He looked past her briefly, into the house, that gesture some men do without thinking, the one that says this space might be about to become my concern, then back to her face. "Just in the neighborhood," he said. "Thought I'd stop and see how you're getting on." "I'm getting on fine." He nodded slowly. His eyes moved to the east field, barely visible in the fading evening light. The white shapes of turkeys moving at the margin. "Heard about your birds," he said. "Bold move." Ruth said nothing. "Turkeys are unpredictable," he said. "Heritage birds, especially. My grandfather ran some. Lot of trouble for what you get out of them." "I'll let you know how it goes," Ruth said. He smiled. That smile. The one that stopped at the jawline. "Thing is," he said, and he took one step up onto the porch, just one. "Just enough. I've been watching this property for a while. And I want to be straight with you, because I think you deserve that." He paused. "I can make you a fair offer. Today. You wouldn't have to go through another season of this. Another season of this." Ruth felt something cold move through her. Not fear. It was closer to recognition, the sensation of understanding. "Exactly what you're dealing with. I'm not interested in selling," she said. "The tax situations is my situation." He held her gaze for a moment. Something behind his eyes recalculated. "Well," he said finally. He stepped back down off the porch. "Offer stands. You know where to reach me." He walked back to his truck without hurrying. She stood in the doorway until he was gone. Then she went back inside, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the 2 business cards still sitting in the kitchen drawer. She opened the drawer. She took both cards out. She walked to the sink and ran them under the tap until the ink blurred. She set them on the counter to dry, then thought better of it and threw them away. The turkeys were still working the field margins in the dark, making their low, muttering sounds. She listened to them for a while before she went to bed. She didn't sleep well that night either, but she got up before sunrise anyway, because the corn wasn't going to watch itself, and the birds needed moving to the next panel rotation, and there was a cracked T-post on the north fence she'd been putting off. She pulled on her boots at 5:47 in the morning and went outside. The air smelled like summer coming, like soil warming up and doing what soil does when you give it the right conditions quietly, without asking for credit, without caring whether anyone believes it will work. She walked the field. The corn looked like corn always looks at that hour, gray-green and private, keeping its own counsel. But she stopped at the same cluster of stalks she'd been watching and crouched down again and looked at them in the early light. Still holding. She stood up. She stretched her back. She looked across the field to where 56 birds were beginning to stir in the growing light, shaking themselves loose from sleep, starting their patient, relentless work. Dale Pritchard thought he had until August. He was going to need a new calendar. The first week of June arrived the way difficult things often do, not with a warning, but with a change in the quality of light. The mornings got longer. The heat started settling in before noon instead of waiting politely until afternoon. And Ruth Calloway's cornfield, which had been holding its breath for 2 full weeks, began to exhale. She didn't celebrate. She wasn't the type. But she did start keeping a log. Every morning before 6, she walked the same transect through the east field, the same 16 rows, the same 50-yard stretch, and she noted what she saw. Stalk condition, silk color, evidence of new worm entry holes versus old inactive damage. She photographed the same marker stalks she'd tagged with strips of orange surveyor's tape. She'd done this kind of documentation before, half-heartedly, the way you do things when you're not entirely sure they matter. Now she did it the way you do things when you know that whatever happens next, you'll need to be able to prove it. The birds were working. That much was undeniable. Not perfectly, nothing about 56 semi-feral turkeys was going to be described with that word, but they were working in the way that things work when they're designed for a job rather than trained for it. The Narragansett bronze crosses moved through the margins with a low, ground-level intensity that Ruth had come to find almost meditative to watch. They didn't need direction. They didn't need encouragement. They needed the rotational fence panels moved every 4 to 5 days, access to clean water, and to be left largely alone to do what their instincts told them to do. That part she could manage. What she couldn't manage was the feed cost that was running about $40 a week over what she'd budgeted. She'd underestimated how much supplemental grain the birds would need while the insect population in the margins was still establishing itself as a reliable food source. $40 a week didn't sound like much until you were already stretched to the place where $40 was a decision between that and something else. She moved money around on paper. She cut her own grocery runs to twice a month instead of weekly. She found a grain supplier 2 counties over who sold in bulk at a better per-pound rate, which meant a 2-hour round trip every 3 weeks, but saved her roughly $60 each run. She did the math on the back of an envelope, sitting in the cab of her truck in the supplier's parking lot, and the math worked barely. Not comfortably. But it worked, and she drove home with a truck bed full of grain and her jaw set at an angle that people who knew her recognized as the face she made when she'd decided something. She'd decided she wasn't going anywhere. The trouble was, not going anywhere and actually staying were 2 different things, and the distance between them was measured in things like property tax bills and bank statements, and the slow, grinding calendar of a farming operation that produced no income between the planting season and the fall harvest. She had one asset she hadn't touched. Curtis's life insurance had paid out a policy that, after the funeral costs and the 2 outstanding equipment loans, had left Ruth with a little under $19,000. She'd put it in a separate account and hadn't used it for anything. Not because she didn't need it, she'd needed it plenty of times, but because the day she opened that account was the day she understood, in a way she hadn't fully understood before, that this money was the last thing Curtis had been able to do for her. Spending it felt like finishing something she wasn't ready to finish. She'd held it for 3 years and 8 months. In the second week of June, she transferred $4,000 to cover the property tax arrearage. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the transfer confirmation on her laptop for a long moment. Then she closed the laptop and went out to check the birds. It was Pauline who told her about the county extension meeting. Pauline Ostranger had been attending the Harker County Agricultural Extension meetings for 11 years, which she described as an act of stubbornness masquerading as civic engagement. The meetings were held monthly in the basement of the county agricultural building in town and were attended, in Pauline's words, by the same 14 people arguing about the same 6 things in a slightly different order each time. They're doing a session on integrated pest management next. Tuesday, Pauline said over the fence one morning, "University researcher coming down from Nashville. You should go." Ruth was moving a fence panel and didn't stop. "I've got the night rotation to check on Tuesdays." "I'll check it. Go to the meeting." Ruth looked at her. "I'm serious," Pauline said. "You need to talk to somebody who knows about what you're doing. Get some outside eyes on it. You've been out here doing this by yourself for 6 weeks, and you're starting to make the face." "What face?" "The face where you're fine, but you're also about 6 quiet conversations away from not being fine." Ruth pulled the stake, reset it, drove it in. She didn't argue with that because she couldn't, really. Pauline had known her long enough to be accurate. "One meeting," Ruth said. "One meeting." She went. The county extension building was a low brick structure that smelled like old coffee and agricultural pamphlets, a specific combination that Ruth associated with every county-level government function she'd ever attended. The basement meeting room had fluorescent lights, a folding table with a coffee urn, and 12 chairs arranged in a rough circle. 9 of them were occupied by the time Ruth arrived at 7:02. She recognized most of the faces. Bobby Luttrell, who ran a beef operation southeast of town. Maris Chen, who did market garden and cut flowers. 2 brothers named Holt, whose names she always mixed up. The county extension agent, a young woman named Deb Walters, who was perpetually overworked and perpetually cheerful in a way that suggested she'd made peace with both conditions. The researcher from Nashville was a man named Dr. Alan Sutter, mid-50s, with the specific look of an academic who has spent enough time in actual fields to have lost the purely theoretical affect. He wore a chambray shirt and had a notebook that was nearly full. He sat in a folding chair like a man who had sat in a lot of folding chairs and didn't have strong feelings about it. He was talking about corn earworm pressure when Ruth came in. She took the nearest empty chair and tried to be inconspicuous, which was not entirely possible because several particular attention her with the particular attention of people who have recently been discussing you. She ignored it. After Sutter finished his presentation, which covered chemical control windows, resistance development in local worm populations, and the increased pressure being reported across Middle Tennessee this season, Deb Walters opened the floor. Bobby Luttrell asked about application timing. The Holt brothers argued about buffer zones. Maris Chen asked a question about beneficial insect populations that Sutter answered at length. Then Deb Walters said, "Ruth, you want to tell, Doctor?" Sutter about what you've been doing." Ruth looked up. She hadn't planned to say anything. She'd planned to listen, take notes, and leave. But 8 faces were looking at her. And Alan Sutter was looking at her with the specific attention of a researcher who has heard something secondhand that he finds interesting. And she thought, fine, I've got 56 Narragansett bronze crosses running the margins of my cornfield, she said. Rotational panels, moving them every 4 or 5 days. I started 6 weeks ago. The earworm pressure I was tracking in the east field has stopped advancing. Sutter leaned forward very slightly. Stopped advancing or reversed? Stopped. I can't say reversed yet. I need more time. What was your infestation level when you started? Maybe 30% of the stalks I was monitoring showed active entry. Some of them were repeat damage stalks from last season. And now? 6%, maybe 7%. And the new entries are concentrated at the far west end, which is the section I haven't gotten the birds to yet this rotation. There was a pause in the room. Not a skeptical pause, a listening one. That was different. How are you managing the birds in relation to the corn itself? Sutter asked. Margins only. They're not going into the standing crop. The perimeter netting runs about 4 feet inside the field edge. Sutter wrote something in his notebook. Bobby Latrelle, who had not been particularly friendly when Ruth walked in, said, "Heritage birds doing that? I thought they were too unpredictable." "They are unpredictable," Ruth said. "But unpredictable doesn't mean unmanageable. It means you have to manage differently." After the meeting, Sutter approached her while she was putting on her jacket. "I'd like to come out and look at what you're doing," he said, "if you're willing. I've been researching rotational poultry integration for pest management for 4 years. Most of the operations I look at are either too small to be statistically meaningful or too large to be replicable by individual farmers." He paused. "Yours sounds like it might be neither." Ruth looked at him for a moment. She was accustomed to people offering interest and then showing up with an agenda attached. "You're welcome to come look," she said. "I'm not signing anything, and I'm not changing what I'm doing to fit a study. Understood, and I want to know what you find. That's fair." She drove home thinking about the meeting. She thought about Sutter's notebook, nearly full. She thought about the way the room had shifted when she started talking not dramatically, but perceptibly. The way a room shifts when it realizes it's hearing something it didn't expect. She thought about Bobby Latrelle's face. She thought about Dale Pritchard saying, "I give her till August." She pulled into her drive, got out, and walked the night rotation. The birds were settled in their roost, murmuring in the dark. The corn stood in rows that looked, in the flashlight beam, exactly as it always looked, green, closed, keeping its own counsel. She stood there for a while. Alan Sutter came out on a Thursday morning, which was the only morning Ruth could accommodate him without rearranging the panel rotation schedule. He arrived on time, which she appreciated, and he came alone, which she appreciated more. He brought his notebook and a camera, and a soil probe, and did not at any point suggest that she explain what she was doing in terms he could understand, which she appreciated most of all. She walked him through the rotation system. He asked questions that were specific and practical: panel spacing, rotation interval, water management, how she was handling the bird's instinct to range beyond the designated margins. She answered honestly, including the parts that hadn't worked and the adjustments she'd made. He crouched next to the marker stalks she'd been tracking. He looked at them for a long time without saying anything. He photographed them. He photographed the soil at the field edge, the physical evidence of the bird's activity, the scratching, the droppings, the disturbed surface, and then he stood up and looked across the field to where about 20 birds were working the current panel rotation. "How much of this came from the extension literature?" he asked. The general idea did. A paper from the Land Grant Extension Service, probably 8-9 months old. The specifics I worked out on my own. Trial and error. Mostly error, Ruth said, until it wasn't. He nodded. He wrote something in his notebook. "The damage pattern you're seeing is consistent with what I'd expect from effective biological pressure," he said. "I'd want to come back in 4 weeks and again at harvest to have something I could put numbers to," but he paused, choosing words carefully the way scientists do when they don't want to overstate something. "What you've done here is not nothing." "I know it's not nothing," Ruth said. "The question is whether it's enough." He looked at her. She thought he was going to say something comforting, and then she was going to have to revise her opinion of him. But he didn't. Yeah, he said. That's the question. She made him a cup of coffee before he left, and they sat at her kitchen table, and he told her, without being asked, what the research literature said about scale. The problem with poultry integration in pest management was always scale. The ratio of birds to acres was tricky. The timing window during corn's vulnerable stages was narrow, and the capital cost of getting enough birds to make a meaningful impact was prohibitive for most individual operations. 56 birds on 14 acres, he said. That's actually a reasonable density for what you're trying to do. I didn't calculate it, Ruth said. I just raised my paddle. He looked at her over his coffee cup. Well, he said, sometimes that's how it works. After he left, Ruth washed the 2 cups and set them in the drying rack and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the east field. The sun was fully up now. The corn had that mid-morning look, solid, particular, the individual plants distinguishable in the light, each one its own problem and its own possibility. She let herself for about 30 seconds feel something that was in the neighborhood of hope. Then she put it away and went back to work. Because hope without the next task attached to it was just a feeling, and feelings didn't move the fence panels. The problem with the north fence started on a Friday afternoon, which was the worst possible time for problems, because it meant working through the weekend without the option of getting parts or supplies until Monday. She'd noticed a sag in the netting near the northwest corner about a week earlier. She'd reinforced it with an extra step-in stake and a zip tie, and told herself she'd do a proper fix on Sunday. Sunday windows were dark. Sunday she'd been dealing with a bird that had gotten a foot tangled in a loose wire in the barn, which had taken an hour and a half to resolve without injuring the bird further or injuring herself. By the time that was done, it was dark and the fence fix had slipped to Monday. On Friday afternoon, the northwest corner failed. Not catastrophically. A section of netting about 8 feet wide had come loose from the T-posts at the top and folded down, leaving a gap that a determined turkey, and all of her turkeys were, by nature, extremely determined, could push through without difficulty. She found out because she was counting birds during the late afternoon check and came up too short. She counted again. 54 in the rotation area. The barn birds accounted for. 2 missing. She followed the most logical escape route, northwest where the gap was, and found the first bird about 60 yards out, standing in the unmown strip between her field and Cody Marsh's property line, eating something with great concentration. The bird regarded her arrival with the specific expression of an animal that knows it's been caught but hasn't decided to acknowledge that yet. Ruth got the bird back in 20 minutes. It was not a cooperative 20 minutes. The second bird took 45 minutes, and a considerable amount of walking to locate it had gone further east than she expected, through a gap in the creekside brush, and was standing in about 6 inches of water in the shallow stretch of Sheldon Creek, apparently content with this decision. She waded in after it. The water was cold. Her boots were not waterproof in any practical sense. She got the bird, which expressed strong opinions about being retrieved, and carried it back to the property with wet boots and a long scratch on her right forearm from a branch she hadn't ducked under in time. She fixed the fence in the dark with a headlamp, using wire and extra netting she had rolled in the barn, kneeling in the field edge with her wet boots soaking through her socks. It took another hour. When she was done, the repair wasn't elegant, but it was solid, and she tested it 3 times before she was satisfied. She ate supper at 9:30, cold, because she hadn't thought to start anything before going back out and hadn't wanted to take the time. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at her forearm. The scratch wasn't deep, but it was red and long, and her whole forearm ached in a way that suggested she'd torqued something getting through the brush. She thought about calling her sister in Memphis. She thought about it and then didn't do it, because her sister would be sympathetic in exactly the way that made Ruth feel worse. Rather than better, the sympathy of someone who believed, kindly but firmly, that Ruth had taken on more than she could manage. Ruth didn't want to have that conversation when she was sitting in wet socks at 9:30 at night, with a scratched arm and 2 wayward birds successfully recovered. She'd call her sister when she had better news to report. She wrapped her arm, changed her socks, and went to bed. Dale Pritchard came back on the 2nd Saturday of July. This time he didn't come alone. He brought a man Ruth didn't recognize, younger, early 30s, carrying a clipboard, who he introduced as his property assessor. as though they were already past the stage of whether Ruth was selling and were now in the stage of logistics. Ruth stood on the porch and looked at them for a moment. "I didn't invite an assessor," she said. "Just getting a sense of things," Dale said. "For my own records. Your records about my property." "Ruth," he smiled, the jawline smile. "I'm trying to be straightforward with you. I think you're doing something ambitious here, and I respect that. But I also know what the tax situation looks like, and I know what the harvest projections look like for corn in this county this season, and I want to make sure you have options. I paid my tax arrearage." Something shifted in his face. Very small, very fast. But she saw it when, 3 weeks ago. He recovered quickly. "That still leaves the note on the property. The note is mine to manage." The young assessor with the clipboard had said nothing. He was looking at the field, looking at the birds, which were visible along the east margin. His expression was neutral in the way that people who work for someone else's agenda learn to make their expressions neutral. "I've seen what you're doing with the turkeys," Dale said, "and I'll be honest, it's more than I expected. But one good season won't fix what's structurally wrong here. You know that?" "I know what I know," Ruth said, "and what I know is you need to take your assessor and go." "Ruth, I'm not going to be rude about it," she said, "but I'm also not going to stand on my own porch and listen to a man tell me what's structurally wrong with my property." "You can go." Dale held her gaze for 3 long seconds. Then he nodded once, with the controlled deliberateness of a man filing something away for later. They left. Ruth went inside and sat down at the kitchen table. Her hands were steady. She noticed that, specifically, because she expected them not to be. She thought about what he'd said, "One good season won't fix what's structurally wrong here." She turned the sentence over. Not because it scared her, because there was enough truth in it to be worth examining honestly. One good season wasn't a solution. She knew that. A profitable harvest in the fall would cover the note payment, replenish what she'd spent, and give her a margin going into winter. It would not eliminate the fundamental vulnerability of a one-person operation on land that needed 2 people's worth of work. It would not fix the drainage issue in the low field. It would not replace the aging tractor that had started throwing error codes she didn't understand. But it would give her another year, and another year was the only thing she needed right now. Not a solution. A year. She got up, went to the shelf where she kept the farm records, and pulled out the binder with the harvest projections she'd worked up in April. She sat back down and went through them again, column by column, with the patient attention of someone who has decided that panic is not an option, and the only alternative to panic is information. The corn was showing better than she'd projected, not dramatically. She wasn't going to pretend the earworm suppression was a magic cure for every problem in the field, but meaningfully better. The stands were thicker. The silk browning she'd tracked in the previous 2 seasons had not appeared in the east field at all this year, and the west field was running significantly below what she'd documented in the same period last year. She had a lot in line in the projection for turkey-related pest reduction. She'd put a 10% improvement estimate next to it in April, which had felt optimistic. She looked at it now and thought, maybe not optimistic enough. She didn't change the number. Not yet. She wanted another month of data. But she closed the binder with a different feeling than she'd opened it with. It was Maris Chen who first mentioned the farmer's market. They ran into each other at the grain supplier, Maris picking up supplies for her market garden, Ruth doing her biweekly bulk run, and they stood in the parking lot in the heat and talked for 20 minutes in the way that people talk when they're both busy but have something to say. "You should be selling honey," Maris said. Ruth looked at her. "I don't have bees." "Not yet, but you could." Maris tilted her head in the direction of Ruth's property, which was not visible from where they stood, but which both of them could picture clearly. "You've already got the infrastructure mindset? You're doing the rotational grazing, you're thinking about pollinators and pest ecology. Bees would fit. Bees are a whole other operation. So we're 56 turkeys, and you figured that out." Ruth couldn't argue with that. She thought about it on the drive home. Bees were not something she'd considered. Her energy had been entirely consumed by the turkey project and the corn. But Maris wasn't wrong that the logic connected. Pollinators, pest management, soil health, the pieces of an integrated system rather than a monoculture. She filed it in the back of her mind. Not for now. For the next year, if there was one. That evening, Pauline came over with a jar of iced tea and sat on Ruth's porch without being invited, which was a thing Pauline had done for 4 years, and which Ruth had given up protesting. Dale Pritchard was here, Ruth said. It wasn't a question. Cody Marsh told Frank, Pauline said. Cody saw the truck in your drive. He brought an assessor. Pauline was quiet for a moment. That's aggressive, she said. Yeah. Are you worried? Ruth looked at the east field. The last light was on it, that particular late July light that makes everything look more significant than it probably is. I'm worried about the right things, Ruth said. I'm not worried about Dale Pritchard. What's the difference? The right things I can do something about. Pauline drank her iced tea. A mockingbird was running through its catalog somewhere in the tree line. The birds had settled. Alan Sutter called Deb Walters, Pauline said. About your operation, she told me. Ruth looked at her. He wants to include your field in a multi-site study he's doing this fall. He's already got 3 other sites in the state. He thinks if the harvest numbers support what he's been seeing out here, it could be significant. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She thought about the notebook that was nearly full. She thought about Sutter saying what you've done here is not nothing. What does that mean for me practically? She said. Nothing yet. Maybe nothing at all. But it means somebody with credentials is paying attention to what you're doing. And that's not nothing either. No, it wasn't nothing. Ruth sat on her porch in the late July heat, listening to the mockingbird, and thought about the distance between where she'd been in April and where she was now. Not a triumphant distance, not a straight line. A scrambling, improvised, expensive, exhausted distance that had involved wet boots and escaped birds, and a lot of nights at the kitchen table doing math she didn't want to do, but distance nonetheless. She thought about Dale Pritchard's face when she'd told him the tax arrearage was paid, that small, fast shift. She'd been replaying it since Saturday without quite knowing why. Now she thought she knew. It was the face of a man who had built a timeline and discovered that the timeline had changed without his permission. She wasn't on his schedule anymore. She was on hers. Down in the east field, in the dying light, 56 Narragansett bronze crosses settled into their evening behavior, the low, murmuring restlessness before roosting, the quiet assertion of birds that had spent the day working and were now in their way, satisfied. Ruth watched them until the light was fully gone. Then she went inside, updated her log, and started thinking about what needed to happen in August. August came in hard. Not the slow, drowsy heat that Middle Tennessee usually delivered in the back half of summer, the kind that made everything feel slightly underwater and forgivable. This August came in with an edge to it, a dry, pressing weight that settled over the fields by 7 in the morning and didn't lift until well after dark. The soil in the low fields started cracking along the furrow lines by the second week. Ruth's rain gauge recorded less than a quarter inch in the first 18 days of the month. She moved the bird panels every 3 days instead of 4 or 5, because the ground in each rotation section was getting worked over faster in the dry conditions. The birds were drinking more. She added a second water station in the east margin and checked both twice daily, lugging 5-gallon jugs from the barn spigot in the mornings, when the day was still cool enough to make the work bearable. By the third week of August, the corn in the east field was tasseling. She walked the rows every morning before 7, touching the tassels, checking the silk, counting the ears developing on the stalks she'd been monitoring since June. The numbers were better than she'd projected in April, meaningfully better. The earworm suppression had held through the critical window, the period between V10 and silking, when the crop was most vulnerable, and the stands were fuller than they'd been in 3 years. She wrote the numbers in her log. She didn't let herself feel too much about them, because the harvest was still 6 weeks out. And 6 weeks was a long time for things to go wrong. She knew that better than most. The call from Alan Sutter came on a Thursday morning while she was filling the water jugs. She set them down, answered on the third ring, tucking the phone against her shoulder while she wiped her hands on her jeans. I've been out to 2 of my other study sites this week, he said without preamble. Both of them are showing significant earworm pressure. One of them lost close to 25% of projected yield in the last 3 weeks. Conventional chemical management. Ruth didn't say anything. She was looking at the east field. Your numbers from the last documentation visit, Sutter said, are holding in a different category entirely. I want to be careful about drawing conclusions before harvest, but I'll tell you honestly, what you're seeing out there is not typical for this county this season. What is typical this season? Losses. The pressure has been unusually high across the region. USDA is tracking it. A lot of operations that had normal or even above normal stands going into July are reporting significant damage in August. Ruth thought about the county extension meeting, about Bobby Latrelle and his questions about application timing, about the Holt brothers and their buffer zone arguments. Bobby Latrelle's operation, she said, I don't have his specific numbers, but I know the pressure is widespread. She picked up a water jug. What do you need from me? Nothing. Right now. I'd like to do a full documentation visit about 2 weeks before you start harvest. Walk every row section if you'll let me. Get canopy closure measurements, ear count estimates, visible damage documentation. A pause. I'd also like to bring a graduate student, if that's all right. She's writing her thesis on alternative pest management systems, and your operation is, frankly, it's the kind of thing she should see. Ruth thought about strangers in her field. She thought about what that meant: more eyes, more opinions, more people who could later say they'd been here and seen this, and form their own ideas about what it proved or didn't prove. Then she thought about Dale Pritchard and his assessors with the clipboard. Fine, she said. Call me the week before you want to come. She hung up and stood in the barn holding the water jug for a moment. Not typical for this county this season. She thought about what it meant when what everyone else was losing was exactly what you'd spent the spring building a defense against. She thought about Chet Bowers, handing her that folded piece of paper in the parking lot. Don't try to control them. Try to direct them. She thought about 56 birds working the margins in the early morning, the low sound they made, the systematic patience of animals doing what they were designed to do. She went out and filled the water stations and moved on to the next task. It was Cody Marsh who first brought her the news about the Hendersons, and he did it in the way he did most, without intending to be useful. He was leaning on the fence at the road edge on a Friday afternoon when Ruth came back from a supply run, and he flagged her down with the casual authority of someone who hasn't quite figured out that flagging down a person on their own road requires a certain standing. She stopped. She rolled down the window. Henderson Place got hit hard, he said. Tom Henderson, east side of the county, lost almost a third of his corn already. Worm pressure. Ruth said nothing. My dad talked to him at the co-op, Cody said. Tom's pretty shook up. Had a crop insurance claim pending from last year still. He paused, looking at her field with the expression of someone reassessing a calculation. Yours looks different. Yes, Ruth said. I mean, it looks really different. Tasseling out thick. I was watching from the road this morning. She looked at him. Cody Marsh was 22 years old and had laughed at her at the auction and had driven past her fence work twice on purpose, and she knew all of that. She also knew that he was his father's son, and his father was a decent man who'd made his own mistakes and learned from some of them. The birds are doing their job, she said. You really think that's what it is? I know that's what it is. He was quiet for a moment. He had his hands in his pockets and he was looking at her field with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the amused skepticism of the auction, not the calculated observation of someone waiting for a failure. Something more like genuine uncertainty. The face of a young man who has been confident about something and is beginning to wonder if his confidence was based on accurate information. My dad's got a problem, Cody said quietly.
Southfield.
Caught it late. Ruth looked at him. I don't know what to tell him, Cody said. The chemical stuff isn't doing what it should. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She thought about the laugh at the auction. She thought about the slow drive-bys on the road. She thought about those things again, and she also thought about the fact that she was 47 years old, and could she distinguish between the things she was owed and the things that were useful? And she thought, tell him to call Alan Sutter at UT Extension, she said, and tell him the rotation timing matters more than people think. Once the earworms are established in the ear, you're behind. Cody nodded slowly. He seemed surprised she'd said anything at all. Okay, he said. Thanks, Ruth. She rolled up the window and drove up to the barn. She sat in the truck for a minute after she parked. She thought about what it cost to be decent to people who hadn't been decent to you. The answer wasn't nothing it never was, but it was a smaller cost than the alternative, which was carrying the accounting of it everywhere you went. She got out and went to work. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Ruth recognized the return address before she even picked it up off the porch mat, the Harker County Assessor's Office, the slightly off-center printing of the county seal that she'd seen on enough official documents to know what they looked like. She carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table and made a cup of coffee before she opened it. It was not, as she'd half feared, a new tax notice. It was a certified document indicating that a formal request had been filed with the county assessor's office to review the agricultural classification of her property. An agricultural classification review. If the property's use was determined to no longer qualify for the agricultural tax rate, the reassessment would result in a significantly higher property tax burden retroactive to the current fiscal year. The letter did not name who had filed the request. It didn't need to. Ruth read the letter twice. She set it on the table. She drank her coffee. She looked out the window at the east field for a long moment, the way she looked at the field when she needed to think and needed something real to look at while she did it. Then she called Pauline. He filed a classification review, she said when Pauline picked up. Pauline was quiet for 2 seconds. On what grounds? The letter doesn't specify. But the classification review asks whether the property is actively generating agricultural income, which it is just not yet this harvest cycle. Can you do that? Apparently someone can, and I don't think it's a coincidence that it's happening in August. Pauline exhaled. Ruth could hear her working through the same logic. The agricultural tax rate was what made the property financially viable. Without it, the tax burden would nearly triple, and if that burden was retroactive to the current year, which the letter clearly stated it could be, it would be a number Ruth couldn't cover even with a good harvest. You need to talk to someone who knows property tax law, Pauline said. I know. Deb Walters might know who to call. Or there's a legal aid organization in Clarksville that handles agricultural property issues. I've seen their flyer at the extension office. Ruth wrote down both possibilities on the notepad. She looked at her handwriting, slightly cramped, the way it always got when she was tired and trying to hold too many things at once. He's doing this because the tax arrearage didn't work, Ruth said. He expected me to fall behind again, and I didn't. So now he's trying a different door. Yes, Pauline said. That's what I think too. How many doors does he have? Pauline didn't answer right away. Ruth hadn't really expected her to. How's the corn? Pauline said instead. Better than projected. Then that's your answer. Document everything. Get the classification review in front of someone who knows how to respond to it. And keep the harvest numbers coming. Ruth nodded, even though Pauline couldn't see it. After she hung up, she sat at the table for another few minutes. She thought about what Dale Pritchard was doing, the patience of it, the methodical testing of different pressure points, and she felt something that was neither fear nor anger, but was perhaps adjacent to both. A kind of cold recognition. He wasn't going to stop. He'd found a rhythm of pressure, and he was going to maintain it because men like that understood that sustained pressure over time produced results that single dramatic actions didn't. She understood that too. She just needed to make sure she could outlast it. She called the legal aid number in Clarksville. The organization was called the Tennessee Agricultural Legal Assistance Program, and the woman who answered the phone was named Carol Yates, who had the efficient, unhurried manner of someone who had handled a lot of urgent calls and learned to make people feel heard without making them feel like the situation was more dire than they could manage. Ruth explained the classification review. Carol Yates asked 7 specific questions, in order, and Ruth answered all of them. At the end, Carol Yates was quiet for a moment. The review itself isn't unusual, Carol said. They're filed periodically, and the county processes them. The issue is the timing and the language around retroactivity. A pause. Do you have documentation of active agricultural use? Production records, expense records, anything that establishes the land is being worked as a farm? I have everything, Ruth said. I've kept logs since April. Expense records going back 4 years. A university researcher has been doing documentation visits for a study. Another pause. Longer this time. That last part is useful, Carol said. If Dr. Sutter's documentation is on file with the university, that's third-party evidence of active agricultural use that predates the review filing. It's harder to argue the property isn't actively farmed when there's an academic paper being written about it. Ruth hadn't thought about it that way. What do I need to do? She said. File a response to the review with supporting documentation. I can help you prepare that. I'll also reach out to the county assessor's office to make sure the response goes into the file properly. Carol paused. Whoever filed this, do you know who it was? I have a reasonable idea. Is there a business relationship between that person and any county officials you're aware of? Ruth thought about that. Dale Pritchard's office in Clarksville. His holdings. The reach that someone with money developed over time in a small county. I don't know specifically, she said, but I wouldn't be surprised. Okay. Carol's voice didn't change. Then we document everything very carefully and we make the response bulletproof. The goal is to make this the most boring, thoroughly supported agricultural operation in Harker County. Despite everything, Ruth almost smiled. I can do boring, she said. Good. Come in Thursday if you can. Bring everything. Ruth drove to Clarksville on Thursday with 4 years of farm records in a cardboard box and her documentation logs from the current season in a separate folder. She sat across from Carol Yates for 2.5 hours and answered questions and watched a competent person build responses out of everything she'd been keeping track of since the beginning. At one point, Carol picked up the log from the current season, the one Ruth filled out every morning before 6, the one with the orange-tagged stock photographs clipped to the inside cover, and flipped through it slowly. You've been doing this since April, Carol said. Since before April, Ruth said. The photo documentation started in late March. Carol looked at her over the folder. Did you know you were going to need this? Ruth thought about it. I knew I was going to need to be able to prove what I was doing, she said. I didn't know specifically what I'd need to prove it against. Carol nodded. She went back to the documents. Okay, she said. I think we're in good shape. Ruth drove home with the empty cardboard box in the folder and a slightly lighter feeling in her chest. Not relief. She'd learned not to reach for relief before something was actually resolved, but something. The cornworm reports started coming in from across the county in the 3rd week of August, and they came in fast. It wasn't a single dramatic event, no single day when everything fell apart for everyone. It was the accumulative weight of individual reports, farm by farm, that built into something that people started talking about in terms they usually reserved for named disasters. The dry August had stressed the crop at exactly the window when the earworm pressure was highest. Chemical management was failing. In some operations, not because farmers hadn't applied it, but because the resistance problem that Sutter had mentioned at the extension meeting was real and wider than most people had understood. The co-op in Harker County started getting calls that it couldn't answer well. The extension office was overwhelmed. Deb Walters was driving the county roads every day. Stopping at operations that had called in with questions, she was struggling to answer to anyone's satisfaction. At a certain point, the road in front of Ruth's property became a place people slowed down when they passed. She noticed it first on a Wednesday. A pickup she recognized as Frank Ostrander's Pauline's husband, who had never once expressed an opinion about her operation, either way slowed almost to a stop at her field edge and stayed there for 20 or 30 seconds before driving on. 2 days later, a woman Ruth didn't know well, she thought her name was Janet something, from the north end of the county parked at the road edge and stood looking at the east field for a full 5 minutes before getting back in her car. Ruth watched from the porch. The woman didn't come to the gate. On Saturday, Bobby Luttrell called her. She almost didn't answer because she didn't recognize the number, but something made her pick up. Ruth, it's Bobby Luttrell. A pause. The kind where a person is organizing what they want to say and discarding versions that don't work. I heard from Deb Walters that your corn is holding. It's holding, Ruth said. How much loss are you running? Current estimate is under 8% in the east field. West field is running a little higher, but still below 15. Silence on Bobby's end. She could hear him processing that. My south section lost 30%, he said. I've got 240 acres. And the south section is where I'm running my highest inputs. Premium hybrid seed, full chemical program, the works. Another pause. You're running 50-some birds and a wire fence, and you're at 8%. Ruth didn't say anything. She wasn't sure what Bobby wanted from her vindication. An explanation, absolution, information. Maybe some combination. I want to understand what you did, Bobby said. I'm not calling to argue with you. I'm calling because my operation is hemorrhaging, and I want to understand what you did. She thought about the auction. She thought about the extension meeting, Bobby's questions about application timing, his face when she'd spoken about the birds. She thought about the fact that Bobby Luttrell had never been deliberately unkind to her, just doubtful, and doubt in farming is its own kind of unkindness, but not the worst kind. "Come out," she said. "I'll walk you through it." He came on Sunday morning with his hat in his hands. Almost literally, he held it while they walked the field, turning it slowly in his fingers. She walked him through the full rotation system. She showed him the documentation logs. She explained the panel spacing, the timing intervals, the water management, the specific behavior patterns of the birds, and how she'd adapted the rotation to work with them instead of against them. He asked good questions, practical ones, the kind that come from someone who actually farms and not just someone who thinks about farming. She answered all of them. At the end, standing at the east field edge, he looked out at the stand of corn, the thick, full tasseling corn that was 6 weeks from harvest and looking like 3 years of effort compressing into a single visible argument. "I owe you an apology," he said. "No, you don't," Ruth said. At the extension meeting, "Bobby," she looked at him. "You had a question about my operation. You asked it. That's what that meeting is for." He turned his hat again. "I've been farming this county for 22 years, he said. "And I think I've been doing it with my eyes half closed on some things. The chemical dependency, the input escalation. I knew it was getting expensive, and I knew it wasn't working as well as it used to, and I just kept doing it anyway, because it was what I knew." Ruth looked at the corn. "That's not a character flaw," she said. "That's what happens when something works for a long time and then slowly stops working. You don't notice the stopping because it's gradual. How'd you notice?" "I couldn't afford not to." Bobby was quiet for a moment. "I want to try something on the south section next season," he said. "Whatever you're willing to share about how you set this up. Talk to Alan Sutter first," she said. "He's been documenting this all season. He'll have numbers I don't have, and he's bringing another site into his study. This fall, ask him about inclusion. You'd be okay with that? Me being part of the same study?" Ruth looked at him. "Bobby, the more people this works for, the better the evidence. I'm not trying to keep something proprietary here. I'm trying to get through October." He nodded. He put his hat back on. "Good luck," he said. "I mean that. I know you do." She watched him drive away and then stood at the field edge for a while. The birds were working the current panel rotation about 100 yards south of where she was standing. From this distance, they were just moving shapes in the grass, copper and gray, patient and purposeful. 56 animals that her county had laughed at, that Dale Pritchard had calculated against, that she'd bought on impulse and then built a system around with fence wire and 5-gallon water jugs and a morning log she filled out before 6 every day without exception. She thought about what she'd said to Bobby. "I'm not trying to keep something proprietary here." She'd meant it. But she also understood that the moment she said it, she'd articulated something she'd been feeling for a while without naming, that this wasn't only about her farm anymore. It was becoming something slightly larger than one woman's operation on 14 acres. The people slowing down on the road, Sutter's study, Bobby Luttrell standing in her field with his hat in his hands. Even Cody Marsh telling her his father had a problem. She hadn't planned for any of that. She'd planned to save her farm. The rest had arrived the way most things arrived, when you were too busy to look up and anticipate them quietly, gradually, until one day you looked around and the world had rearranged itself while you were working. Alan Sutter came out for the pre-harvest documentation visit on a Thursday in mid-September, 2 weeks before Ruth planned to start the harvest. He brought his graduate student, a young woman named Teresa Vance, who's 26 years old, serious-faced, and had a clipboard that was already half full when she arrived. Teresa shook Ruth's hand and looked at the field and said "oh" in a quiet way that was not performative. They spent 4 hours in the field. Sutter ran his documentation methodology canopy measurements, ear counts per row section, visible damage assessments, soil sampling at 6 points along the rotation transect. Teresa worked beside him with focused efficiency, talking quietly to herself as she recorded numbers. Ruth walked with them and answered questions and showed them the log, which Sutter went through slowly, page by page, with the expression of someone reading a document that is doing something he didn't expect a document to do. "You shifted the rotation interval in week 7, he said, from 5 days to 3. The dry conditions were changing how fast the birds were working each section, Ruth said. I adapted." He made a note. He looked at the original rotation section photographs And then it's the same sections as they appeared now. Teresa, he said. I see it, she said, without looking up from her clipboard. The recovery pattern in Section 3 is consistent with what we saw at the Wilson site, but running about 12 days ahead. Sutter looked at Ruth. The Wilson site is twice your acreage, with a similar rotation density, he said. Their recovery pattern from earworm pressure started about 3 weeks later in the season. What does that mean? Ruth said, possibly nothing. Possibly that your early implementation timing gave you an advantage in the establishment phase. He wrote something. That's what the study is for. Teresa looked up from her clipboard. She was looking at the bird rotation, the current panel section, where about 20 birds were working with the systematic low-intensity attention that Ruth had been watching every day for 4 months. Can I ask you something? Teresa said. Sure, Ruth said. When you raised your paddle at that auction, how much did you actually know about what you were doing? Ruth looked at her. The question was direct in the way that young researchers ask direct questions not rudely, but without the social lubricant that older people add to hard questions. Enough to think it might work, Ruth said. Not enough to be sure, but you did it anyway. I didn't have a better option. Teresa wrote something. Sutter was looking at the field. That's interesting, Teresa said. Because 3 of the 4 sites in this study were implemented by people who researched the method extensively before attempting it. You're the only one who went in on instinct and adjusted on the fly. And your numbers are, she paused, reviewing her clipboard, your numbers are the best in the study. Ruth didn't say anything for a moment. I'm not sure what that proves, she said. Neither am I yet, Teresa said. That's what the thesis is for. The classification review response was filed with the Harker County Assessor's Office on September 9th. Carol Yates had prepared it. It was 43 pages with supporting documentation, including 4 years of farm records, the current season's production logs, Alan Sutter's preliminary field documentation reports, and a letter from Deb Walters at the County Extension Office describing the operation as an active and innovative agricultural enterprise of regional interest. 43 pages of the most boring, thoroughly supported agricultural operation in Harker County. Ruth signed the submission at Carol's desk and drove home. She was 2 weeks from harvest. The corn was tasseled and full and heavy in the way that corn gets when it is doing exactly what it is supposed to do, not because someone forced it, not because the conditions were perfect, because they hadn't been, but because the right pressure had been kept off it at the right time. She parked at the barn and walked the east field one more time in the late afternoon light. She touched a tassel. She looked down the row, the long, full, heavy row of corn that 3 years of setbacks had been building toward, and 1 season of 56 determined birds had helped protect. Her boots were dirty. Her forearm still had the faint line of the branch scratch from July. She'd put 17,000 miles on the truck since April between supply runs and meetings, and one trip them to Clarksville that had produced 43 pages of the most important boring document she'd ever signed. She stood in the field and breathed for a minute. Just breathed. Then she went inside to update the log. 2 weeks. 2 weeks, and she'd know if it had worked well enough to matter. The harvest started on a Tuesday, not because Tuesday was significant or auspicious or anything, other than the day the moisture readings in the east field finally dropped to the range Ruth had been waiting for. Most of its windows were dark. She'd checked the grain moisture every morning for the past week with the handheld meter she'd borrowed from Pauline's husband, Frank, crouching between the rows in the pre-dawn dark, pressing the probe against the kernels and reading the number and calculating whether it was time. On Monday, it was 18%. On Tuesday morning, it was 16.4. She called the grain elevator in Harker County at 7:15 to confirm the day's pricing and availability at the receiving station. She serviced the tractor one more time oil check, hydraulic fluid, the PTO shaft that had been making a noise she didn't love since August. She ate breakfast, which she sometimes forgot to do on high-pressure days, and which she'd started making herself do deliberately because she'd learned the hard way that forgetting to eat was its own kind of false economy. Then she went out and started the harvest. She was alone for the first 3 days. That was by choice. She'd thought about asking for help. Frank Ostrander had offered his labor, and his equipment Latrelli had made a vague gesture toward assistance when he'd walked her field in August, but she wanted to start alone. Not out of pride, or not only out of pride, She wanted to know what the numbers were before anyone else saw them. She wanted to stand inside the reality of this harvest by herself, first, before it became a thing other people witnessed and commented on and fit into their own narratives about what Ruth Calloway had done or not done. The combine ran through the east field in long, slow passes. Ruth drove it herself. She'd done it before, not often, and not confidently, but she'd done it and she settled into the rhythm of it over the first few hours. The specific, physical, slightly deafening world of harvest operation, where thinking gets compressed into monitoring and adjusting and staying in the row. The yield monitor on the old combine wasn't fully reliable. She knew that. She'd had it recalibrated in the spring, but it still ran about 5% high on the display, so she applied that mental correction in real time as she worked. Even corrected, even running the numbers conservatively, what she was seeing on the display by the end of the first day was better than what she'd put in the April projection. She didn't tell anyone yet. She drove the grain cart to the elevator, ran the paperwork, drove back. She checked the birds. Still running the south margin rotation, she'd shifted them to 4 weeks ago to keep them off the standing crop. She updated the log. She ate a bowl of soup at 9:30 and went to bed and lay there for 20 minutes thinking about the day's numbers before she made herself stop and sleep. The east field took 4 days. By the end of it, she had a set of elevator receipts, a set of yield calculations done twice on the notepad and once on her phone's calculator app to make sure she hadn't made an error, and a final number that she sat with for a long time on Friday evening before she let herself fully believe it. East field yield, 19% above her April projection, 31% above the previous year's actual yield. Visible earworm damage in the harvested rows, 6.2% average. The county average that season, according to the data Sutter had shared with her, was somewhere between 22 and 27%, depending on the operation. She wrote the numbers in the log. She looked at them. Then she called Pauline. "Eastfield is done," she said when Pauline answered. And Ruth told her the numbers. There was a silence on Pauline's end that lasted several seconds. "Say that again," Pauline said. Ruth said it again. "Ruth." Pauline's voice had changed. Not dramatically, Pauline wasn't a dramatic person, but it had changed in the specific way voices change when emotion is present and being kept in careful check. That's a real number, I know. That's not a good try number. That's not a well you survived number. It's a number. I know, Ruth said again. Her voice was steady. She was looking at the notepad. What does the West Field look like? 2 more days. Maybe 3. The moisture is still a little high on the low end. Okay, Pauline exhaled. Okay, do you need help? Frank's coming Monday, Ruth said. And I told Bobby Luttrell he could send over his operator for the North Rows on Tuesday. It'll go faster. Good. Ruth. Yeah, how are you? Ruth looked at the numbers again. She thought about April. She thought about the auction. She thought about wet boots and a cold creek and a fence she'd fixed in the dark with a headlamp. She thought about the kitchen table at 9:30 at night, with cold soup and a set of numbers that scared her. I'm okay, she said. I'm really okay. Frank Ostrander showed up Monday morning at 6:45 with a tractor and a grain cart, and the particular quiet competence of a man who has been farming for 30 years and knows how to show up to someone else's operation and be useful without being in the way. He and Ruth worked the West Field in parallel, Frank on the north half, Ruth on the south, and the work went faster than she'd expected. Not fast. Farming didn't go fast, but faster. Bobby Luttrell's operator, a man named Deshawn who was in his late 30s and said less in 3 hours than most people said in 3 minutes, arrived Tuesday and took the North Rows. He had a smoothness with the equipment that Ruth admired from the other side of the field. By Wednesday afternoon, the West Field was done. Ruth stood at the field edge with the final receipts in her hand and did the math one more time on her phone because she didn't trust herself with numbers she wanted to be true. Westfield, 12% above projection, 14% above last year. The lower number reflected the reality that the birds hadn't reached the west margin until later in the season. The rotational system had started east and worked west, and the West Field had carried a slightly higher damage load as a result. 12% above projection was still 12% above projection. She combined the east and west numbers into the full season total. She sat with it. The total yield adjusted for moisture, adjusted for market pricing at the day of delivery, after elevator fees represented the best harvest from this property in at least 6 years. Possibly longer, but she didn't have Curtis's records from before she'd started keeping them herself, so she couldn't say certainly. It was enough. Not comfortable, not lavish. Not the kind of number that eliminated all the problems at Swant or made the aging tractor stop throwing error codes or fix the drainage in the low field. But it covered the remaining note payment with margin. It replenished most of what she'd spent from Curtis's account. It gave her a winter cushion that she hadn't had in 3 years. It gave her the ability to plan the following season from a position of something other than desperation. It was enough to stay. That was all she'd needed it to be. She drove the last load to the elevator and stood in line behind 2 other trucks and listened to the radio, playing something low and country, and waited her turn. When the elevator manager, a heavy-set man named Ted, who had been taking her loads since Curtis was alive, came out and checked the load and ran her paperwork, he looked at the total and looked at her and said, "Good year for you." "Better than most," Ruth said. "Lost a lot of people this season," Ted said. "Worm pressure. Never seen it this bad across the board." He handed her the receipt. "Whatever you're doing, it's working." "Turkeys," she said. He looked at her. 56 turkeys, she said, running the margins. He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in the way people shake their heads at things they'd never have thought of themselves. "Well," he said. "Yeah," Ruth said. She drove home. The letter from the Harker County Assessor's office arrived on Thursday. One day after she finished the harvest, which she could not decide was coincidence or timing. The envelope was identical to the previous one, except for the printed notation on the outside indicating it was a formal response to a filed petition. She opened it at the kitchen table. The agricultural classification review had been completed and resolved. The property at 4,417 Sheldon Creek Road, was confirmed to retain its agricultural classification. The review had found sufficient evidence of active agricultural production to sustain the existing classification. The matter was closed. Ruth read it twice. She set it down. She thought about the 43 pages Carol Yates had built. She thought about Sutter's documentation reports. She thought about Deb Walter's letter describing the operation as an active and innovative agricultural enterprise of regional interest. She thought about every morning log before 6, every photograph she'd taken of the orange-tacked marker stalks, every fence panel she'd moved, every 5-gallon water jug she'd hauled. She thought about the fact that a man who wore clean boots and had an assessor with a clipboard had spent most of the summer calculating the precise moment she would fail, and she had not failed on his schedule or anyone else's. She folded the letter. She put it in the farm records binder behind the harvest receipts, in the section she'd labeled Current Year Documentation. Then she called Carol Yates. "It's resolved," Ruth said when Carol picked up. "The classification review came back in my favor." "Good." Carol's voice was warm, in the professional, contained way that people are warm when they've worked hard on something and it came out right. "I expected it would, given what we submitted. The documentation was thorough. You built a good case. You gave me good material to build it with." A pause. "What are you going to do now?" Ruth looked at the binder. She looked at the harvest receipts. "Stay," she said. Dale Pritchard came by on a Saturday. It was mid-October by then. The fields were harvested and empty in the way fields get after harvest, not desolate, just resting, showing the worked-over texture of a season that had run its full course. The turkeys had been shifted to a winter management system rotating between the barnyard and the south pasture. Since their field margin work was done for the season, they were louder in winter proximity. Ruth had gotten used to the noise. She saw his truck from the kitchen window. She recognized it before it was close enough to read the plate. She watched it slow and pull up to the edge of her driveway and stop. She waited. He got out alone this time. No assessor. No clipboard. He walked to the porch and knocked in that same deliberate way he always knocked, and Ruth opened the door, watched it before he'd finished, because she'd been watching him come up the drive. They looked at each other. "Ruth," he said, "Dale." He looked different. Not diminished, not exactly. But something in his posture had shifted slightly from the last time he'd stood on her porch. The particular quality of certainty that wealthy, patient men carry as a kind of physical attribute was still present, but it had a different quality now, like a garment that had been washed slightly too many times. I heard the harvest came in well, he said. It came in fine, Ruth said. Better than fine, from what I understand. Ruth said nothing. He put his hands in his pockets. She noticed he wasn't in his usual pressed shirt. He was in a fleece jacket, more casual than she'd ever seen him, which she thought might be intentional. An attempt at a different register. I want to be straight with you, he said. You've said that before. I know. He nodded once. I know I have. He looked at the field, the harvested field, empty and resting. I filed the classification review. Ruth had known it was him. Hearing him say it was different from knowing it. I know you did, she said. I started. He stopped. He tried again. I thought the pressure would be enough. That, combined with the tax situation and the timing of the season at a point where an offer would start to look different to you. You thought I'd be desperate enough to take it. He looked at her. His jaw moved slightly. Yes, he said. That's what I thought. The honesty was unexpected. Ruth had prepared for a different version of this conversation, the polished version. The version with exits and deniability built in. This version, with its stripped-down admission, required a different response. What do you want, Dale? She said. I want to... He stopped again. He was not a man accustomed to not knowing what he wanted to say. She could see him locating the words the hard way. I've been in this business for 23 years, acquiring distressed properties, and I'm good at it. I know how to read when an operation is at its end. I've been right more times than I've been wrong. But you were wrong about me. I was wrong about you, he said. And I owe you an apology. For the classification review, that was... He paused. That was using a legitimate process for a purpose it wasn't designed for. And I knew that when I filed it. Ruth stood in the doorway and looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it would cost her to say what she actually felt. The full accounting of it. The nights at the kitchen table. The wet boots. The scratch on her arm. The $4,000 from Curtis's account. The way he'd looked at her the first time he came to her porch, that assessment, that calculation. And the way she'd felt it land and had chosen not to let it move her. She thought about all of that, and she thought about what it would do if she said it. I accept the apology, she said, but I want to be clear about something. He waited. This property was never distressed, she said. It was undercapitalized and short-staffed and running a problem I hadn't solved yet. Those aren't the same thing, and the people who couldn't tell the difference, including you, weren't looking at the property. You were looking at me. You saw a woman alone, and you made a calculation based on that. Dale was quiet. That's the apology I'd actually want, Ruth said. Not for the classification review. For the assumption. Something moved across his face. It wasn't comfortable. She didn't need it to be comfortable. You're right, he said. It came out quiet. Not performative, not practiced. Just quiet. Ruth nodded once. She didn't say anything else on that subject. She let it settle where it had settled. The property's not for sale, she said. Not now, not next year, not when I have a bad season. Which I will, everyone does. I know, then we understand each other. He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded. He took a card out of his jacket pocket. She recognized it as his business card, the same card she'd thrown away twice, and he held it out for a second, then seemed to reconsider. He put it back. I'll let you get on with your day, he said. He walked back to his truck. He got in. He drove away. Ruth stood in the doorway for a while after his truck had gone, looking at the empty harvest field, the bare rows, the rested earth. She thought about Curtis. She thought about the way he used to stand at the field edge in October, when the harvest was done, just standing and looking. He'd never explained what he was looking for or was looking at. She'd never asked. She thought now that maybe he wasn't looking for anything specific. Maybe he was just standing in the space between one season and the next, in the particular quiet of a farm after the work of the year is finished, letting it be what it was. She understood that now. She went inside and updated the log, the last significant entry of the season. Then she made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and did something she almost never allowed herself to do, nothing. Just sat. Alan Sutter called on a Tuesday in early November. I've run the preliminary numbers from all 4 sites, he said. I want to share them with you before we finalize anything for the paper. Ruth had her log in front of her. Old habit. Go ahead, she said. Your site outperformed the other 3 on every primary metric. Yield preservation, earworm suppression rate, cost per acre of implementation, compared to comparable chemical programs, all 4 metrics. Your cost per acre advantage is particularly significant. Once you amortize the bird acquisition cost over the operational life of the flock, the input cost runs about 40% below a conventional integrated pest management program for a comparable acreage. Ruth wrote the number down, 40%. That's a number people will notice, she said. Yes, Sutter said. The other thing worth noting is that your implementation was the least technically refined of the 4. 2 of my other sites had farmers who'd researched this method extensively, worked with extension advisors in the planning phase, had infrastructure support I don't have records of you having. You built this on your own, mid-season, without a preparation period, and your numbers are the best. Ruth thought about what Teresa had said in the field. You went in on instinct and adjusted on the fly. What's the paper saying? Ruth asked. Teresa is writing it. She's framing the case studies around adaptive implementation, specifically the argument that farmer responsiveness and real-time adjustment may be as important as technical preparation in biological pest management systems. Your site is the central case. A pause. With your permission, we'd like to use your documented logs as primary source material. The daily records, the photograph documentation. It's unusually thorough for an individual farmer operation. You can use them, Ruth said. I want acknowledgement in the paper. Absolutely. Your name, your operation, your methodology. Teresa is adamant about that. She wants, and I agree with her, to make it visible that this was done by a working farmer with limited resources, not a research station with full support. Ruth looked at the log, the record of every morning before 6, the orange-tagged photographs, the fence panel counts, the water station checks, the escaped birds, and the repaired fences, and the numbers she'd recalculated twice because she was afraid to believe them the first time. Okay, she said. One more thing, Sutter said. The Harker County Extension Service wants to run an informational session this winter. Practical implementation of rotational poultry in pest management. They've had interest from 8 farmers already after this season's losses. Deb Walters asked if you'd be willing to present alongside me. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She thought about the extension meeting in June. 12 chairs, bad fluorescent lighting, 9 farmers who'd turned to look at her when she walked in late. Bobby Luttrell with questions about application timing. Her own voice saying unpredictable doesn't mean unmanageable. Yes, she said, I'll present. Good. I'll have Deb reach out. After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table for a while. The birds were audible from the barnyard, their ongoing, opinionated noise, the sounds of 56 animals that had spent a season doing consequential work, and were now in the slightly restless condition of working animals in their off-season. They needed something to do. She'd been thinking about expanding the winter foraging area. It would mean more fencing, more fence panel work in the cold. She'd done it in the summer heat. She could do it in the cold. Pauline came over on a Friday evening with a bottle of wine she'd been saving for what she described only as a specific occasion. She didn't explain further. Ruth understood. They sat on the porch in the November cool with their jackets on, and Pauline poured 2 glasses, and they sat in the particular quiet that longtime friends can share without it being awkward. What are you planning for next year? Pauline said eventually. Expanding the rotation system to the north pasture, Ruth said. The birds need more range. And I want to add a second water system. The single station setup worked, but it was a lot of juggling in the dry stretch. She looked at her glass. And Maris Chen keeps bringing up bees. Pauline looked at her. Bees, honeybees, for pollination and honey production. Pauline turned her glass slowly. That's a whole other thing. Everything is a whole other thing, Ruth said. The turkeys were a whole other thing. True, Pauline drank. Are you going to do it? Ruth thought about it. She thought about the conversation with Maris in the grain supplier parking lot. She thought about the fact that she'd said not for now, for the next year if there is one. There was a next year now. The question was what to do with it. I'm going to research it this winter, she said. See what the capital cost looks like. Start small, Pauline said. Like 4 or 5. Ruth looked at her. Pauline was smiling. Not broadly, Pauline's smiles were restrained things, but it was there. Don't raise your paddle too fast this time, Pauline said. I might, Ruth said. They sat in the November dark with their wine and the birds making noise in the barnyard and the empty resting fields spread out beyond them. The land looked different in November than it did in August, starker, more itself, without the full cover of the crop to soften what it was. Ruth liked it this way. You could see the bones of the place, the actual structure of it. 14 acres of Tennessee hill country that had been farmed by her husband and now by her, with all the imperfection and difficulty that entailed, and with all the things she'd figured out and all the things she still needed to figure out. She thought about Curtis again. She thought about him more in November than in other months. She didn't try to analyze that or manage it. She just let it be what it was. He would have loved this, Pauline said quietly. She hadn't said who. She didn't need to. Yes, Ruth said. He would have. They sat for a while longer. The birds settled. The wind came down the valley in one long, easy push and moved through the bare trees and went on. The county extension session was scheduled for the second week of January. In the month between the phone call and the session, Ruth did 3 things. The first was to go through her full-season log and compile a clean summary document of the implementation methodology, the rotation intervals, the water management, the panel spacing calculations, the specific behavioral adaptations she'd made over the season. She wrote it, the way she wrote everything plainly, specifically, without softening the parts that hadn't worked or streamlining the adjustments she'd made in real time. She ruffled it so that a farmer reading it could actually do what she'd done, not so that it looked impressive on paper. The second was to call her sister in Memphis. Her sister's name was Donna, and she answered on the second ring, and Ruth could hear the particular cautious preparation in Donna's voice, the brace for whatever Ruth was calling to report. Because as experience, Ruth's calls came in 2 registers, practical and urgent. I have good news, Ruth said, a pause. Tell me. Ruth told her. The harvest numbers, the classification review, the paper, the extension session. She told it in order, the way she told things not dramatically, just sequentially, the way events had actually happened. When she finished, Donna was quiet for a long moment. Ruth, she said. Her voice was different. Ruth, that's I didn't know. I know you didn't, Ruth said. I didn't want to tell you until I knew. You were going through all of that, and you didn't. I needed to handle it myself first. Donna was quiet again. Ruth could hear her working through the mix of hurt and understanding, and something that was possibly relief at a level too deep to be comfortable with. Are you okay? Donna said. Actually okay, not Ruth okay. Ruth thought about that distinction. Donna had been making that distinction for 47 years. Ruth had been annoyed by it for most of them. I'm actually okay, she said. I'm tired. The tractor needs a repair I can't afford until spring. 3 of the birds are acting like they might be coming down with something, and I'm watching them closely. The drainage in the low field is still wrong. But I'm staying, and I know what I'm doing, more than I did in April. Donna exhaled. It was a long exhale, the kind that carries a lot of accumulated breath. Come for Christmas, Donna said. Both of you, I mean just you. I always say both of you, and I know, Ruth said. I will. The third thing Ruth did in that month before the extension session was go out to the barn on a Tuesday morning, not for any specific task, not because something needed doing, and just stand with the birds for a while. 56 Narragansett bronze crosses in their off-season state. Bigger than they'd been in the spring. Louder. More settled into their own nature, which was difficult and independent and entirely indifferent to human opinion. She stood in the barn, and they moved around her with the specific semi-wild ease of animals that have been around humans long enough to be comfortable, but not long enough to be tame. One of them, the large bronze female who'd been the first to go through the Northwest Gap in July, who'd stood in Sheldon Creek regarding her own rescue with profound skepticisms, came close enough to be touched and then moved away. Not spooked, just decided. Ruth let her go. She stood in the barn and listened to the birds and thought about the season that had passed, not comprehensively, not in any organized way, just let the images come. The auction, the panic math in the truck, the extension meeting, Sutter's nearly full notebook, Bobby Luttrell with his hat in his hands, the classification review letter, the harvest receipts, Dale Pritchard's face when he said you're right. She thought about the cornworms that had taken 22 to 27% of the county's yield that season, farm by farm, row by row, with the patient indifference of organisms doing exactly what they were designed to do. And she thought about 56 birds doing exactly what they were designed to do. She needed them. They'd done the work. Neither thing had been pretty or simple or without cost. And she was still here. And the farm was still hers. And in January, she was going to stand in front of 8 farmers who'd had a hard season and tell them exactly how she'd done it, and exactly where she'd made mistakes, and exactly what had been harder than she'd expected. All of it. Not the version that sounded like a lesson, the version that had actually happened, because that was the only version that was going to be useful to anyone. She went out and checked the water stations and started the day. The extension session was held on a Wednesday evening in January, which was not ideal weather for anyone to drive anywhere in Harker County. But 15 people showed up anyway. Not 8, 15. Deb Walters had told Ruth to expect 8, maybe 10 if the weather held. The weather did not hold it, dropped to 28 degrees by 4 in the afternoon, and there was a freezing drizzle that made the roads unpleasant. And 15 people came anyway. Most of its windows were dark, which told Ruth something about how bad the previous season had been for people and how much they needed something they didn't have yet. She recognized most of the faces. Bobby Latrelle was there, in the second row of folding chairs, with a notepad already open. Frank Ostrander sat beside Pauline in the back. Maris Chen was near the window. Cody Marsh came in at 7:03 and took a chair at the edge of the row, which Ruth noted without comment. A woman she didn't recognize, late 50s, work jacket, the careful eyes of someone who had driven 40 minutes in freezing drizzle, because she needed the information, sat in the front row with a pen in her hand before Deb had even started the introduction. 2 of the faces she didn't recognize at all. Younger farmers, maybe mid-30s, who had the look of people who'd inherited land recently and were still learning the specific anxiety of that. Sutter presented first. He put his preliminary data on a screen, the foresight comparison, the yield metrics, the cost per acre analysis. He presented it the way academics present things, which is thoroughly and somewhat slowly, with appropriate caveats about preliminary data and sample size, and the need for replication across seasons before drawing broad conclusions. The room listened. The room was quiet in the way that people are quiet when they're doing math in their heads. Then Ruth stood up. She had 3 pages of notes. She used none of them. She told them what she'd done in the order she'd done it. The auction, yes. On impulse, yes. She was aware of how that sounded. The capital cost. The gap between the idea and the reality of implementation. The escaped birds. The fence repair in the dark. The rotation interval adjustments she'd made when the dry August changed the timeline. The water station problem. The Northwest Gap. The creek. She told them what had failed before she told them what had worked, because that was the honest order. The woman in the front row wrote continuously. Bobby Latrelle stopped writing at some point and just listened. Cody Marsh was very still. The biggest mistake I made in the first month, Ruth said, was trying to run this the way I'd run a conventional livestock operation, trying to control where the birds were at any given time, instead of designing a system that directed them. Once I stopped fighting their instincts and started using them, everything got easier. She paused. Not easy. Easier. A man she didn't recognize, one of the younger ones, raised his hand. What's your mortality rate been? Over the season? 3 birds lost. 1 to a predator event. We think a coyote got through a gap in the south fence in late July. 2 to illness in late September. Out of 56, that's about 5%. Lower than I expected going in. What breed would you recommend for someone starting smaller? The woman in the front row asked. Narragansett or Narragansett cross for cool seasons. They're hardy and they forage aggressively. If you're starting with a small acreage, I'd say don't go below 15 birds below that. You don't get the coverage density that makes the suppression effect real. But don't start with 56 either. Start with 20. Learn how they move before you scale. She answered questions for 40 minutes after Sutter sat down. Not because she'd planned to. Deb had allocated 20 minutes for Q&A, but because the questions kept coming, and she kept having answers. And at some point, Deb made a small gesture that meant keep going if you have more, and Ruth kept going. When it was done, the woman from the front row came up and shook her hand. My name is Patricia Hollis, she said. I've got 22 acres east of Cooperton. 3rd year of significant earworm pressure. I drove 40 minutes tonight because I didn't know what else to try. I know that feeling, Ruth said. I want to try this in the spring. Would you be willing, if it's not too much to ask, would you be willing to answer questions if I run into trouble? Not regularly. Just if I hit something I can't figure out. Ruth looked at her, the careful eyes. The pen she was still holding. Yes, Ruth said. Call me. She wrote her number on the back of one of Deb's extension office cards and frotted it to Patricia Cowhollis, who folded it with the careful attention of someone who understands the value of a specific piece of information. Cody Marsh was waiting near the door when she was putting on her coat. He didn't say anything for a moment. He had that look again, the one she'd first seen at the field fence in July. The uncertain look, the one that had replaced the confident smirk he'd had at the auction. My dad came close to selling to Pritchard this fall, Cody said. He didn't, but it was close. Ruth looked at him. I think he would have, if the South Field hadn't started recovering in late September. The chemical program finally started working again when the pressure dropped off after the dry spell broke. He paused. He's still thinking about next year, about what to do differently. Tell him to come talk to Alan Sutter, Ruth said, and tell him to come walk my field in the spring when I'm setting up the new rotation. I'll show him the setup. Cody nodded. He was quiet for a second. I laughed at you, he said, at the auction. I want you to know that I know that. Ruth put on her second glove. I know you know, she said. She left it there. Some things didn't need more than that. She drove home in the freezing drizzle, with her 3 unused pages of notes on the passenger seat and the heat running full and the radio off. She thought about Patricia Hollis and her 22 acres and her pen. She thought about the younger farmers with the inherited land anxiety in their faces. She thought about Deb Walters' small gesture, keep going. She hadn't expected to be someone who kept going in front of a room. She'd expected to survive the season and stay on the property and do it again next year. That had been the whole plan in April. That was still the core of it. But something had accumulated around the core that she hadn't anticipated this conversation, this room, these 15 people who'd driven in freezing drizzle because they needed something she had. She didn't have a clean thought about that. She wasn't sure she needed one. It was just something she'd have to sit with and let become what it became. She got home at 9:15, checked the birds, updated the log habit, even in January, even with nothing in the fields, and went to bed. Teresa Vance's thesis defense was in February at the university in Nashville, and Sutter asked Ruth if she wanted to attend. She said yes, before she'd thought about whether it made sense, logistically. Then she figured out the logistics. The defense was on a Thursday afternoon. Ruth drove up Wednesday evening and stayed overnight at a budget motel, off the interstate, which she paid for out of her personal account rather than the farm account, because it wasn't a farm expense, and she kept those categories clean. She ate at a diner 2 blocks from the motel and read a copy of Teresa's thesis draft that Sussa sent her in January, 214 pages, dense in the specific way of academic writing, but underneath the methodology sections and the literature review and the statistical analysis, the story was one she recognized. She recognized it because she'd lived it. Teresa's central argument was that adaptive capacity, the ability of individual farmers to observe, adjust, and respond in real time, was as important to the success of biological pest management as technical preparation or resource availability. She made this argument with data from all 4 sites. She made it most clearly with the data from 4,417 Sheldon Creek Road. Ruth's logs were cited 41 times in 214 pages. She'd counted. The defense was in a room that was simultaneously very official and slightly shabby, the university's agricultural sciences building, a room with good chairs and bad lighting, and a whiteboard that had been erased imperfectly, leaving ghost equations from some previous session. About 20 people were there, the committee, other graduate students, a few faculty members, and in the back row, Sutter and Ruth. Teresa presented for an hour. She was nervous in the first 5 minutes, in a way that was visible and then not visible. She found her footing somewhere in the second slide, and after that she was clear and precise and confident in a way that came from having spent a year knowing her subject completely. When she got to the case study from Sheldon Creek Road, she said, "The farmer at this site, Ruth Calloway, implemented a rotational poultry system with no prior technical training in the method under significant financial pressure during an unusually high-pressure pest season for the region. Her outcomes exceeded all 3 comparable sites in the study. Her daily documentation logs, which she maintained voluntarily throughout the season, provided the most granular primary source data in this research." Ruth sat in the back row and looked at the projection screen, which was showing a photograph of the East Field in August, one of the photographs she'd sent to Sutter in September. The tasseled corn, thick and full, with the rotation fence visible at the margin and the copper shapes of birds visible in the lower left corner. She looked at it for a long time. It was a photograph of a Tuesday. She remembered that Tuesday. It was the day after she'd filed the classification review response with Carol Yates. She'd been tired, and her shoulders had hurt, and she'd taken the photograph because it was her documentation routine, not because she'd known it would end up projected in a university building in Nashville in February. Funny how that worked. The committee asked Teresa questions for 40 minutes after the presentation. Hard questions, specific questions, the kind designed to find the weak points in an argument. Teresa answered all of them. Not perfectly. She said, "I don't have data on that yet," twice, which Ruth appreciated because it was the honest answer both times, but she answered them well. When it was over, the committee stepped out and came back in 8 minutes, and the chair said the thesis was accepted. And Teresa's composure, which had been impressive throughout, broke slightly a quick, involuntary expression of relief that lasted about 2 seconds before she put it back together. Ruth understood that specific expression. She'd made it herself once in a truck cab in a grain elevator parking lot. Afterward, in the hallway, Teresa shook Ruth's hand with both of hers. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I wanted to see how it turned out," Ruth said. Teresa smiled. "It turned out because of your logs, honestly. The documentation gave me something to work with that the other sites couldn't give me. The granularity of it, the daily observations, the adjustment notes, the photographs. It's the kind of data you can build an argument on. I kept the logs because I needed to know what I was doing," Ruth said. "I didn't know they were going to be useful to anyone else." "That's the most interesting part," Teresa said. "You created the data for yourself, not for the research, and that's exactly what made it credible." They stood in the hallway for a few minutes, talking not about the thesis, just talking about what Teresa was planning to do next, which was a postdoctoral position in sustainable agriculture systems at a land-grant university in Ohio, about what Ruth was planning for the spring rotation, about bees, which Teresa had opinions about from the pollinator ecology literature, specific opinions that she delivered with the velocity of someone who has spent a year reading everything and is glad to have a practical person to aim it at. "Start with 2 hives, Teresa said. Not 20, 2. Get comfortable with the inspection cycle and the seasonal management before you scale. The turkeys you can learn by watching them. Bees you have to learn by doing the inspections, and the inspections take practice." 2, Ruth said. 2, Teresa confirmed. "In the spring, once the temperature is consistently above 55. Ruth drove back to Harker County on Thursday evening with Teresa's voice in her head, alongside the accumulated information of the day, the defense, the photograph of the East Field on the screen, the ghost equations on the whiteboard, the 8 minutes the committee had taken to decide. She stopped if its windows were dark. She stopped at the same diner off the interstate where she'd eaten the night before, because the food had been decent and the coffee had been hot, and there was something to be said for knowing what you're getting. She ate and thought about 2 beehives and what that would require, and where she'd put them, and whether the South Pasture's flowering margins would provide enough forage in early spring before the main season began. She thought about it the way she thought about new things. Now, not with the anxiety of someone who doesn't know if they can manage one more new thing, but with the practical curiosity of someone who has learned that most problems are solvable if you're willing to watch carefully and adjust. She drove home in the dark. She checked the birds they were in winter roost mode, settled and loud in the enclosed barn section. She'd built them in December, the cold management system that had taken her 3 weekends to construct and still had 2 boards she wasn't happy with, but that worked. She updated the log. She went to bed. Spring came the way it always did without asking. The most of its week hit in mid-March, and Ruth spent it doing the work of reopening, checking the rotation equipment, assessing the fence panels for winter damage, walking the fields to read what the soil had done over the cold months and what it was going to need. The drainage in the low field had gotten worse over the winter. A freeze-thaw cycle had shifted something in the clay pan layer that was already poorly structured. She walked it twice and crouched and dug a small test hole with her hand and looked at what the water was doing. It was going to need tile drainage, eventually. Not this year. The capital cost was beyond her current season's planning, but eventually. She wrote it in the log under a section she'd started calling Future. The list in that section was neither short nor discouraging. It was just the list of what the farm needed that she hadn't gotten to yet. Every working farm had that list. The question was whether you could keep adding to it faster than it added to you. She was keeping up. In the last week of March, she got a call from Patricia Hollis. "I bought the birds," Patricia said. She sounded both excited and slightly terrified, which Ruth recognized as the appropriate emotional state for someone who had just made a consequential decision. "How many?" 22. Narragansett crosses, like you said. I found a breeder about 30 miles east of me. Good. Have you got your rotation system planned out? I've drawn it out 3 times. I keep changing the panel spacing. Send me what you have, Ruth said. I'll look at it. Patricia sent it that evening a hand-drawn map of her 22 acres, with the rotation section sketched in, the panel spacing noted in the margins, the water station locations marked with small circles. It was careful work. The handwriting was the handwriting of someone who takes notes, the same way Ruth took notes not for show, but for keeping track. Ruth looked at it for a while. She made 3 suggestions, adjusting the initial rotation section to keep the birds closer to the barn in the first 2 weeks while they established, moving the south water station 20 yards east to reduce the birds' travel distance, and adding a backup panel section she could use if the primary section needed an extended rest. She typed them out and sent them back. Patricia responded in 20 minutes. Thank you. Starting next week, terrified. Ruth typed back, good. That means you're paying attention. She set the phone down and went back to work. The 2 beehives arrived in April. She'd ordered the packages in February, after Teresa's advice and after 3 weeks of reading not compulsively, not trying to master the subject before she touched it, but enough to understand the basic management cycle and the specific ways beginners made the mistakes that cost them their first colonies. She'd built the hive bodies herself from lumber, which had taken 2 weekends, and produced 2 functional, if somewhat imprecise boxes that she'd painted white, because white reflected heat, and she'd read that mattered. Chet Bowers, the man who'd sold her the turkeys, had a philosophical objection to commercial agriculture that extended apparently to conventional beekeeping, had agreed to come out for the first inspection. He arrived on a Saturday morning in April with his own gear, and a calm that Ruth recognized as the calm of someone who has made peace with the fact that bees will do what bees do. They suited up at the barn and walked to the south pasture, where she'd set the hives on the cinder blocks she'd built in March. You know you're going to get stung, he said. It wasn't a warning. Just information, I assumed. Some people can't get past that. It shuts them down. I'll find out, Ruth said. She found out on the 3rd frame of the first hive. She'd moved too quickly. She knew it as she did it. The hand speed slightly too fast. The motion not smooth enough, and a bee found the gap at her wrist between glove and sleeve and stung her there. She held still. She kept going. Chet didn't say anything. She finished the inspection. Her wrist swelled into a hot, specific lump by evening. She put ice on it for 20 minutes and then went back out to do the bird check and updated the log. She wrote first sting, wrist, finished inspection anyway. Note slower movements on frame removal. That was all. Chet came back 2 more times over April. By the 3rd visit, Ruth was running the inspection herself, and he was standing nearby answering questions when she had them. By early May, she was doing it alone. The hives were not thriving by any dramatic measure they were establishing, which was different. Slower, more tentative, the work of a colony deciding whether the location was adequate and the management was safe enough to commit to. Ruth checked them weekly, using the inspection checklist Chet had given her and the additional notes she'd accumulated from her own reading, and she documented what she found with the same discipline she'd brought to the corn documentation. She knew better than to expect dramatic results in the first season. She'd learned that lesson with the turkeys. The real work of the first season was learning the system, not harvesting from it. But in June, on an evening inspection, she found something on the 3rd frame of the 2nd hive that made her stop. Capped honey. A section about the size of her palm, the wax capping smooth and pale, covering the cells underneath. She looked at it for a long moment. The bees moved around her hands, indifferent, absorbed in the ongoing work of the hive. She replaced the frame carefully, closed the hive, stepped back, stripped off her gloves. She stood in the south pasture in the June evening air and looked at the 2 white boxes she'd built from lumber in February. She thought about Maris Chen in the grain supplier parking lot. "You should be selling honey." She thought about the specific sequence that had led from that parking lot conversation to these 2 hive bodies to the capped honey on the 3rd frame. She thought about how nothing in that sequence had been part of any plan she'd made in April of the previous year. She'd planned to save the corn. She'd planned to stay on the property. Didn't know that. Everything else had arrived as a consequence of things she'd done while she was trying to do the original thing. That was, she thought, how most of the important things in her life had arrived. Not planned for, just arrived. The paper was published in July. Sutter sent her a copy of the final version, peer-reviewed, in a journal called Sustainable Agriculture and Biological Systems. She sat at the kitchen table and read it from beginning to end, which took her 2 hours. But she read it, because she read it the way she read everything that mattered, slowly, going back over sections she didn't understand, making notes in the margin. Her name was in the acknowledgement section, which she'd known about. What she hadn't expected was the photograph. Sutter had asked her permission in the spring to include 1 photograph in the paper, and she'd said yes, and she'd assumed it would be one of the documentation photographs of the field margin or the rotation setup. It was the photograph of her. Teresa had taken it on the documentation visit in September. Ruth was walking the east field margin, looking at the corn. She hadn't known the photograph was being taken. She was wearing the clothes she wore every day, the work jacket, the jeans with the pocket that had been repaired twice, the boots. She was not looking at the camera. She was looking at the corn with the specific attention of someone who knows exactly what they're looking for and is deciding what it means. Under the photograph, the caption read, "Ruth Calloway, Sheldon Creek Road, Harker County, Tennessee. Season primary site, 4,417. Documentation period, April-September." She looked at the photograph for a long time. She didn't recognize herself exactly, not because it wasn't clearly her, but because the person in the photograph looked like someone who knows what they're doing. And she understood, looking at it, that that was what 9 months of a specific kind of hard work looked like from the outside. It looked like competence. It looked like intention. It looked like a person who belongs in the field they're standing in. She hadn't felt that way at the auction. She hadn't felt it at the kitchen table in April with the numbers that scared her. She'd felt it in pieces, in specific moments, the marker stalks that weren't advancing, the East Field yield numbers, the extension session questions she'd been able to answer. She'd felt it, she realized, since before she knew she felt it. She put the journal on the shelf with the farm records binder. She didn't frame the photograph or tell anyone about it specifically. She just put it on the shelf, where she kept things that mattered, and went out to check the birds. In August, exactly 1 year from the worst of it, from the dry heat and the classification review letter, and Dale Pritchard on her porch steps, Bobby Luttrell called her to say that his south section, running a modified rotational poultry integration he'd implemented in May, was showing less than 10% earworm loss. Against what background pressure? Ruth said. County's running about 18% average this season, Bobby said. Better than last year, but still significant. 10% is good, Bobby. I know. A pause. I've got a neighbor asking me about it. Guy named Waverly, east of my operation. He's had 3 bad seasons. I told him he should talk to you. Tell him to come to the extension session in January, Ruth said. Deb Walters is running it again. I'll be presenting. You're doing it again? Deb asked. I said yes. How many people last time? 15. How many you think this time? Ruth thought about Patricia Hollis and her hand-drawn map. She thought about Bobby's neighbor Waverly and his 3 bad seasons. She thought about the 2 younger farmers who'd sat in the back row in January with the inherited land anxiety in their faces and the notepad open. More than 15, she said. She was right. In January of the following year, 23 people drove to the Harker County Extension Building in cold but dry weather, and Deb Walters had to add chairs from the hallway, and the Q&A ran 45 minutes over the allotted time, and Ruth stood at the front of the room and answered every question as specifically and honestly as she knew how. Patricia Hollis was there. She sat in the second row this time, instead of the front, which Ruth interpreted as the confidence shift of someone who had done the thing once and survived it. Patricia's 22 acres had come through the season with 11% loss, not as good as Ruth's numbers, but significantly better than the regional average and better than Patricia's previous 3 seasons combined. She'd lost 4 birds, 2 to illness, and 2 to a predator event she'd since fenced against. She'd expanded to 30 birds for the following season. She'd also found someone, a woman from her county, 50s, who sat beside her and took the most thorough notes in the room. That was how it worked. Ruth was learning. One person came, learned, went back, told someone, brought someone. Not fast, not linear, just expanding, the way things expand when they're actually useful. After the session in the parking lot, Pauline found her. They stood through Ruth's truck in the cold dark of a January evening, and Pauline had her hands in her pockets and was looking at Ruth with an expression that Ruth couldn't fully read. "What?" Ruth said. "Nothing," Pauline said. I'm looking at you. Stop it. I'm not going to stop it." Pauline smiled. The restrained smile, the one that was all the more real for being restrained. "You know what Frank said to me last week?" "What?" He said, "I think Ruth Calloway might be the most competent person on this road." Pauline paused. "Frank doesn't say things like that about people." He said it like he'd been thinking about it for a while and finally decided it was true. Ruth stood in the parking lot cold and thought about Frank Ostrander, who she'd known for 12 years, who had showed up with his tractor at 6:45 in the morning because she needed help and asked for nothing in return, who had never once expressed an opinion about her operation either way, who had apparently quietly been forming one. "Tell Frank thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was working to keep it that way. "Tell him yourself," Pauline said. "He's inside helping Deb stack chairs." Ruth went inside and helped stack chairs. She didn't say anything specific to Frank, and Frank didn't say anything specific to her, but at some point, he handed her a folded stack of chairs to carry to the storage room, and their eyes met briefly, and he nodded once. In the particular way of people who've said that the important thing through other means and don't need to say it again. She carried the chairs to the storage room. She came back out. The building was emptying, people pulling on coats and exchanging numbers and talking in the particular animated way of people who've spent 2 hours being given something useful and are already figuring out how to use it. She stood for a moment in the doorway and watched them. She thought about the auction, the paddle going up, the man behind her laughing, the drive home with 2 crates of Angry Birds in the truck bed and $800 spent, and no plan fully formed, just the beginning of one. Just the instinct that said, this is the problem, and this might be part of the answer, and you'll figure out the rest as you go. She thought about all the things that could have stopped it. The money, the escapes, the dry August, the classification review, the nights at the kitchen table when the numbers looked like they were written in a language that meant only one thing. She thought about all the things that hadn't stopped it. The difference between those 2 lists wasn't luck, and it wasn't talent, and it wasn't the absence of difficulty. The difficulty had been entirely present every single day. The difference was something smaller and harder to name, something like the willingness to do the next task without requiring certainty about the task after that. The willingness to fix the fence in the dark and check the water station in the rain and fill out the log before 6 every morning, not because you knew it was going to work, but because it was the work. And the work was what you had. She'd been right about something in April that she hadn't fully known she was right about. Not about the turkeys specifically, about herself. About the kind of person she was when she was pressed, not graceful under pressure, not unafraid, not always certain, but still going, still noting, still adapting, still here. She put on her coat and went out to the parking lot. The cold hit her face, and she breathed it in the January air, clean and sharp, and carrying nothing that wasn't itself. The other cars were pulling out. Pauline waved from across the lot. Ruth waved back. She got in her truck. She drove home on dark county roads. She knew by the way you know things you drive every day, not consciously, just in the body, in the hands, in the small automatic adjustments that familiarity produces. She pulled into her driveway. She sat in the truck for a moment. The barn was lit from inside the low warmth of the winter heating system she'd rigged in November. She could hear the birds through the truck window, faintly, their ongoing nighttime conversation. 56 animals that had come home with her from a Tuesday auction and spent a year doing exactly what they were built to do, and had, in doing it, done something she hadn't quite built into the original calculation. They'd changed what people around her could imagine. That was the part she hadn't planned. She thought about Patricia Hollis writing in her careful hand. Bobby Luttrell with his Southfield at 10% loss. The woman from Patricia's county sitting in the second row with the thorough notes. The 23 people in folding chairs on a cold January night. She thought about the 2 beehives in the south pasture with their frames of capped honey. Small and uncommercial, measure, but present, working, building toward something. She got out of the truck. She checked the bird's habit, always, regardless of what else the day had been. She walked the barn perimeter in the dark with a flashlight. She checked the water. She noted nothing unusual. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table. She took out the log, the new one, the second volume, started in October when the first had filled. She wrote the date. She wrote what she'd observed. She wrote, session went well. 23 attendees. Patricia Hollis there with someone new. Chairs ran out. She looked at the entry for a moment. She thought about writing something more, about what the evening had felt like, about Frank Ostrander's nod, about Pauline's face in the parking lot. She decided against it. The log was for observations, not feelings. She had her own ways of keeping track of the things that mattered. She closed the log. She sat at the kitchen table for a while, in the quiet of her house, on her property, on her land, on 14 acres of Tennessee Hill country that no one had taken from her because she hadn't let them, not because she was exceptional, not because she was fearless, but because she had understood, at a Tuesday livestock auction on an ordinary spring morning, that the thing standing between her and the end of everything she'd built was a decision, and she had made it, and then made it again the next day. And the one after that, outside the south pasture, held 2 white boxes that would wake in spring and fill and build. The north fields rested under January cold, holding what the season had put in them, ready for what she'd put in them next. The barn hummed with 56 birds that had never once cared what anyone thought they could do. She'd bought them on instinct. She'd learned to manage them by watching. She'd saved the farm 1 panel rotation at a time, 1 morning log at a time, 1 task at a time. In the only way that anything real gets saved, without waiting to be certain, without waiting to be ready, without waiting for someone else to believe it was possible first. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Tomorrow there was work. There was always work. That had stopped being a problem a long time ago.